So we've been looking at the book of Esther under this title of God Behind the Scene. Just to remind us, the story is set in ancient Persia, and it focuses on how two Jews, Mordecai and Esther, have to negotiate life in that context. And the book highlights what a dangerous place ancient Persia is. There's the king, Xerxes, behaving like a fool, easily swayed, hasty, rushing into things without thinking through the consequences. And then there's Haman, proud and concerned for his reputation above all else, and nurturing a hate towards Mordecai, a representative of a long-standing enemy, a hate which morphs into a plan to wipe out an entire people. So this is a society which is fraught with danger, where security and justice aren't guaranteed, and where particular individuals can marshal the state's machinery to further their own evil ends. Now, meanwhile, due to another set of circumstances, Esther ends up becoming queen, though without her ethnic and her religious identity being revealed to this point. But at this point in the story, there's an edict of death hanging over the Jewish people. And it appears that the only hope is for Esther to make a request to the king. But in doing so uninvited, she would risk her own death. What will she do? And that's the cliffhanger that we finished on last time, 2 weeks ago. Now, meanwhile, where is God? It's not mentioned anywhere in the book. We know that he could step in and deliver his people like he did in the past, but will he? So chapter 4 ends with some unresolved tension. What will happen now? Well, what happens now in the book and over the next few chapters is a little bit like one of those elaborate contraptions, you know, the sort of thing, a little bit like the one on the screen, you know, where a ball drops down a chute, which spins a wheel, which turns a pulley, which sends a series of dominoes falling, which presses a lever, and so on and so forth, until at the end it turns on the kettle or something equally mundane. And usually those, I love those things, you know, there are loads of them on YouTube. Usually those machines involve a series of simple, apparently unrelated devices, and the action of each triggers the initiation of the next, which work together in an unexpected way to bring about a certain result. And we'll see something like that in the book of Esther over the next few chapters. One incident leads to another event, which leads to another moment, and so on and so on. And so we begin in chapter 5 with what I'm calling a decisive step, because this chapter tells us of two of the main triggers, if you like, in this machine. Esther's approach in verses 1 to 8, and Haman's anger in verses 9 to 14. So the chapter is kind of nicely divided between focus on Esther and focus on Haman. And in a sense, both characters, Esther and Haman, they're making plans in their scenes. Both have crises that they want to have resolved. And interestingly, both turn to their spouses in the process. But there's a contrast between Esther's wisdom and Haman's folly, between Esther's patience and Haman's petulance. So let's start with Esther's approach, or a study in patience. Now, back in chapter 1, if you remember, Vashti risked her life by refusing to appear before Xerxes when summoned. Now Esther risks her life by appearing before Xerxes without being summoned. Esther, the book has all sorts of lovely little reversals like that. And not without good reason. I've been looking into it a bit over the last week or so. Here's a relief that's been excavated from Persepolis, a Persian city. In real life, it's about 6 meters long, this thing. And it depicts something of the scene for us. So if you can see that, the character that's in the middle of the screen there is is the Persian king, probably Xerxes' father. And he's on his throne. He has a long scepter in his right hand. Yeah, it's a good quality photo, but it's better seen up close. There's a long scepter in his right hand, and he has a flower. It's apparently a lotus flower in his left hand. And over on the right, you've got someone approaching him. An official approaches him with his hand over his mouth, just kind of classic gesture of deference. Now, standing behind the seated king is the prince, probably Artaxerxes, and he's also holding a flower in his hand. Behind him is an attendant who's got a folded towel, and it suggests that he may be the royal cupbearer. He also doesn't have a beard, so he might be a eunuch. But then behind him is a guy with a large axe. You know, just in case someone does take the foolish step of coming into the king's presence unannounced. It really was someone there with an axe ready to do the deed. So what will happen to Esther as she takes her life into her hands? Well, let's hear what happens in verses 1 and 2. Little reminder, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall, as depicted in that relief, facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out to her the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So everything that the Bible tells us there is obviously confirmed by archaeological reliefs. So she appears before him in her royal robes, we're told. Now, in contrast to Vashti, who refused to wear her royal crown before the king, Esther comes dressed in full royalty. And that's the literal sense here, that Esther, quote, put on royalty. That's the sense here. And it's a word that relates back to what Mordecai said to her in the previous chapter in verse 14. Maybe you have come to your royal position. Literally, maybe you've come to your royalty for such a time as this. And now here we have Esther putting on her royalty to come into the presence of the king. But she comes after 3 days of fasting, which means that she might not look her best, hungry, weary, dehydrated. And we know how Xerxes likes his women. And yet the threat of death passes when the king extends the scepter to her, granting her access to his presence. Now, we might have guessed that would happen, given we're only halfway through the book. It's got her name on the cover. But yeah, we still breathe a sigh of relief. And he was pleased with her, I think the NIV says. She gained, in other words, she gained his favor. Just as it's the same phrase that's used back in chapter 2. Several times about Esther gaining favor. And now, for the first time in the story, she's addressed directly as Queen Esther, verse 3. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." Now, that offer of half the kingdom never intended to be taken literally. That's just an over-the-top royal way of saying, you know, I'm feeling good, try me. How will Esther respond? Verse 4 tells us, "If it pleases the king," replied Esther, "let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." Now, it's perhaps not quite what we were hoping for. Remember, the life of the Jewish people hangs in the balance. Humanly speaking, she's the only one in a position to do something about it. And she invites the king and Haman to a feast. Remember, the book of Esther likes its feasts. Now, in many respects, though, like Xerxes' offer of half the kingdom, she too is observing the standards of etiquette at the time, rather than rushing to a kind of a shopping list of requests. Let's have dinner first. We can talk about that later. There's a bit of kind of etiquette going on here. And the king agrees, verses 5 to 6. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asks. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted. So at the banquet, while the king is drinking wine, he again asks her what she wants. So he knows she doesn't just want a meal with him. And the fact that he asks her while he's drinking wine suggests this is the period after the main meal. So again, Esther hasn't rushed things. But now that the king asks for a second time, will she tell him? Verses 7 and 8. Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. Now, again, we might be thinking, what? Another banquet? And actually, the way she starts her sentence here, it makes it seem like she's going to give her answer. My petition and my request is this. And then she breaks off with this invitation to attend another feast. Although this time she assures the king that she will answer his question then, best not to try his patience too much. Now, we're not told why she delayed her request. Loads of reasons have been offered down the centuries. Social custom, feminine intuition, that's been suggested. Knowing that the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. Is it as simple as that? But whatever the reason, it works. And as the book of Proverbs impresses on us so many times, the wise person knows exactly what to say, exactly how to say it, and exactly the right time to say it. But we can see, I think, that repeating the strategy with the king will make it very difficult for him to refuse when her actual request comes. And in fact, her words here invite him to recognize that fact. In effect, she says to him, if you come again to dinner tomorrow, I'll tell you my request then, and you will grant it then, won't you? So by accepting the invitation to the second banquet, he effectively makes a commitment to go along with that. So by arranging a second feast the way she does, she both locks in the king's permission for whatever she'll ask, and also guarantees Haman's presence there. She is a smooth operator, or whatever the kids call smooth operators these days. But what it does is brilliantly heightens the suspense, not only for the king, of course, but also for us as readers. If we're reading this for the first time, it's a fantastic story. I mean, second, third, fourth time, it's a fantastic story. But while Esther embodies wisdom, Haman comes across as classic fool. And so we think, secondly, of Haman's anger or the study of petulance. Because Haman, of course, is blissfully unaware of what's going on. And the first part of verse 9 tells us he went out that day happy and in high spirits. And it's perhaps no surprise. You know, he sealed the fate of the Jews. He's enjoyed a banquet with the king and his beautiful queen, who asked him to be there. And he's got another feast scheduled for the next day. Life is great. But his happiness, of course, there's always a fly in the ointment. His happiness is ruined by Mordecai, as the rest of verse 9 and then 10 tells us. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. So Haman's pleasure is spoiled by another instance of Mordecai failing to recognize just how important he is. And the fact that Mordecai is at the king's gate almost certainly means he's back at work now. I guess that his 3 days of fasting are over, but it hasn't changed how he feels about Haman. Previously, you might remember Mordecai had refused to bow. Now he doesn't even stand or stare, show fear. When Haman comes by, he basically is not even acknowledging Haman's presence. So what does Haman do? Well, he focuses on trying to restore his wounded pride by reminding himself and anyone else who will listen just how much he has to be proud of. As we see in the last part of verse 10 through to verse 13. Calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons. You think his wife would know how many sons they had, wouldn't you? But there you go. And all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she's invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew and hear the word being spat out on Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. So just as I think Esther's wisdom is progressively revealed through her speech and actions, so Mordecai's folly is progressively revealed through his speech and his actions. And it's sadly ironic, of course, that the very things that Haman is boasting about here will very soon be taken from him. But we can perhaps imagine him coming in, hanging up his robes. What a day. Been dining with the king and the queen. Esther, lovely girl. Very intimate soiree, just the three of us. Yeah, no one else got an invite. Oh, we're doing it all over again tomorrow. Oh, well, I suppose that's what life's like in the fast lane. And it would all be so great if that wasn't that annoying Jew. He spoils everything. I just can't enjoy anything properly while he's alive. Can't wait for the 13th of Adar, when it can finally be shut of him and his kind. And so Zeresh, loving and supportive wife that she is, tells him to get rid of the source of his irritation. Don't have to wait till the 13th of Adar, dear. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted him, and he had the pole set up. So what Zeresh advises here might remind us of the time, when King Ahab was sulking like a spoiled child. Do you remember when he couldn't get Naboth's vineyard, and Jezebel tells him just to arrange the death of Naboth so you can get what you want. And interestingly, in spite of the order of the king back in chapter 1 that every man should be ruler over his whole household, do you remember that ruling? Both Xerxes and Haman in this chapter are very quick to follow the suggestions of their wives. Again, it's one of those nice little reversals. Haman's earlier plan had already ensured that Mordecai would be killed in 11 months' time, but his rage basically escalates that to the point where he can't wait. Only the immediate, agonizing, and shameful death of his enemy will satisfy him. And it would be an agonizing and shameful death. They don't just want to execute Mordecai, they want to humiliate him. Now, some translations say gallows, but what's in view here is a sharpened wooden pole on which victims would be impaled. It was an early form of what became crucifixion. And we're to understand that the arrangements were put in place that very night. What Haman wants, Haman gets. A stake, sir? Certainly, sir. How high? 75 feet. 75 feet, sir. It's a ridiculous height. In fact, commentators say it would have been the highest thing in Susa. So ridiculous is it that some have wondered if it's just an exaggeration. It's just a way of saying very tall, or maybe it was placed on the roof of a tall building or something. But anyways, the idea is being elevated so that everyone can see it. And it says a lot about the pride of a man and his determination to make a public spectacle of Mordecai as revenge for dishonoring him. And it would go down in the history books, that's for sure. He was certain of that. This would go down in the history books. What, 75 feet high? And it did go down in the history books. Although not quite for the reasons that Haman was hoping for. So chapter 5 ends with the resolution yet to come. You know, that marble has dropped down, it's gone through a thing and it's gone somewhere else, but it's only just on its travels. And if anything, the ante has been upped, because Haman's anger against Mordecai means that a train has been set in process, which means that Mordecai will be executed before Esther is able to speak to the king. And that's the dilemma that's now set up at the end of chapter 5. Because if Mordecai is going to be hung in the morning, the banquet's not till the afternoon. It's too late for Mordecai. So as the chapter ends, both Esther and Haman have laid their plans. Esther's table banquet is laid for feasting. Haman's pole is erected for impaling. Whose plan would be successful? Well, we'll have to wait until after Easter to find out. So, as we've done on previous occasions, let's just pause and take a little bit of stock of what we're seeing here, what the lessons might be for us today. First of all, I'd like to suggest we can learn from Esther's boldness. Because in this chapter, she begins to emerge now in the book as the main character. She's the one who takes the initiative, who makes the decisions. She's been fairly passive so far. But that changes as she becomes not just active, but as I think we see in this chapter, she shows herself to have some political savvy. So she assumes the dignity and the power of her royal position, this Jewish orphan girl. She places herself in the right spot to be noticed by the king. She's sufficiently deferential to the king. She's savvy enough to delay her request not once but twice to make sure that both the king and Haman are in play when she needs them to be. And there's a subtle shift as the chapter goes on. Up to this point, Esther has come into the king's presence at the king's bidding, but now that situation is reversed. Esther becomes the hostess, and the king and Haman are entering her space at her bidding. But it wasn't cut and dried. We have, as I say, we have the benefit of knowing the end of the story, but we have to recognize that the time Esther made that decision to come into the king's presence, she had no idea how things would go. In fact, if I perish, I perish at the end of chapter 4 is almost certainly that's the way it's going to end. We don't know what she would have known, the history of her own people, or of God's plan to save families of all nations of the earth. But even if she did know that, she had no personal promise from God for her personal safety. And yet God works through her. So there's a reminder here of what we see elsewhere in Scripture, which is the ways that God shows his faithfulness to his people, to Christians, to churches, and particularly maybe those under persecution. And how we're called ourselves to faithfulness in those circumstances, even when we don't know the outcome. And it might not go the way we would want it to. But of course, it doesn't have to be just in seasons of persecution or difficulty. There might be other times in our lives when we need to take a step that involves courage and conviction, and we might feel weak, we don't know what will happen, whether things will turn out well or become a disaster. What if we crash and burn? What if our hearts are broken? What if we lose out? What if something worse happens that we weren't expecting? What if we go through all of this, whatever this is, and have nothing to show for it? But all we can do in those occasions, by God's grace, is step out in faith, despite not knowing how things will be. Now, wonderfully, with the benefit of our Christian eyes, we also see something of the gospel in Esther's actions. She chooses weakness over strength, and in doing so, she points to someone else who became obedient to death. Esther's decision and journey to the throne room reflects the journey of Jesus, in which his equality with God entitled him to all the honor and glory, but who laid it aside for the salvation of his people. Esther entered a throne room that no one else could rightly enter, and she submitted herself to the potential of the king's wrath in order to protect others from it. And just as the Jews were saved because Esther embraced the possibility of death, so we're saved because our Lord Jesus embraced the certainty of death. As you'll know, the letter to the Hebrews speaks at great length of Jesus' work of redemption as that of the ultimate high priest who enters the ultimate holiest place to offer the ultimate sacrifice of himself so that we might be free and that we might not suffer the fate that we would otherwise receive. And as a result, unlike King Xerxes, God invites us to come into his presence regularly and frequently and boldly. But we can do so only because of the one who's gone before us. So, different lessons from Esther's boldness. But secondly, we can also learn, I think, from Haman's pride. In the story so far, Haman has been active in organizing the planned slaughter of God's people, the Jews, 11 months down the road, effectively a Holocaust. What the Nazis in 1942 called, quote, the final solution to the Jewish question, which is pretty horrific when you think about it. And in this chapter, he wants to bring the day of death forward for one Jew in particular. So here is someone whose appetite for power was absolute and who, egged on by others to be sure, Zeresh and others, he allowed this darkness to grow inside him until it was all consuming. I think in much lesser ways, we can still fall into the trap of Haman, can't we? Scripture warns us many times about the danger of pride. It's perhaps always easier to see it in others than in ourselves. You know, it could be that person we meet for coffee who just talks about themselves the whole time. Doesn't ask you a single question about you or your family. It could be that person who sometimes attractive overconfidence becomes an unattractive arrogance. And you go and think, gosh, that's proud. God, I'm not like that. Or, you know, perhaps we are more like that person than we care to realize, tempted to place pride in, like Haman did, in possessions and achievements and even family. Tempted to seek honor from those around us, tempted to put down any who don't recognize us for who we really are. Not as bad as Haman, to be sure, let's be honest. But still sharing something of the same DNA. Is that fair? 500 years after these events, Jesus would suffer an agonizing, humiliating death at the hands of his enemies. And although he was one who truly deserved honor and worship, unlike Haman, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on the cross. And now, in contrast to Haman, who was full of hatred and vengeance, fueled by this centuries-old grudge, Jesus freely offers forgiveness to anyone, regardless of their offenses against him. In that sense, Haman provides a very strong counterpoint, doesn't he, to our Lord Jesus Christ. But thirdly, we can also learn from this passage about God's oversight. No power on earth is able to thwart God's purposes from coming to pass. And that allows us to trust that God will overrule circumstances and events for our ultimate benefit, not necessarily for our immediate benefit in this life, although he might, but absolutely guarantee for our ultimate benefit. All things really will work together for good to those who love God, and those who are called according to his purpose. Now, that's not to say that things will be hunky-dory. We all know that. But it is to say, as we see in this book, that God has his hands on his people collectively, and we can be sure that his purpose for us and for the nations of the world and for his creation will be fulfilled. But more than that, I just love how this story holds together God's sovereignty and human responsibility so brilliantly. Of course, we're so tempted to play those off against each other, but Scripture never does that. It holds them brilliantly together in a story like this. So God's sovereignty works in such a way that our freedom and our responsibility aren't compromised, and yet the result is still exactly what God purposed to bring about. So Esther and Mordecai and Xerxes and Haman and Zeresh, they aren't compelled to act against their wills as if they're robots or pieces on God's chessboard. They are responsible for their actions. And yet God still works out his purposes through them. But his sovereignty doesn't mean that we just sit back and let God get on with it all. And nor is the outcome totally down to his people's shrewdness. It's great that Esther is shrewd, but the outcome isn't completely down to that, as if God is sitting there nervously on his throne in heaven, biting his nails, just in case we muck things up. God is sovereignly working his purpose out for the good of his people through not just the actions of his people, but through others' actions. And we just see that work out so brilliantly in this story. The king didn't have to extend the scepter, but he did. He didn't have to ask Esther what she wanted, but he did. He didn't have to come to the banquet, but he did. He didn't have to insist that Haman came along, but he did. He didn't have to agree to a second banquet, but he did. God is sovereignly overseeing all these things. But Esther still needs to go to the king. She still needs to prepare herself to do so. She still needs to plan what to say if she manages to survive that axe. She needs, apparently, to have a banquet ready that day in case the king says yes. But God is at work through her courage and her boldness and her shrewdness. So do you see there's this constant back and forth, isn't there, between God sovereignly at work, but doing so through our actions for which we have responsibility and culpability. And yet, to be clear, all the careful preparation in the world doesn't guarantee the desired outcomes, because at the end of the day, God will get all the glory. And it's interesting for me, at least in my preparation, that we were thinking about that in our morning meeting in relation to worry. You know, the fact that God promises to provide for us means that we don't need to worry about food and drink and clothes. But does that mean that we don't need to do anything? No, of course not. We still need to do stuff ourselves, just as the birds need to gather, stuff to build nests and eat. But this can apply in all sorts of areas of life, our relationships, our parenting, our work, our lifestyle choices, our life as a church. The fact that God is sovereign doesn't mean we're absolved from doing what we need to do. And one of the mysteries of his sovereignty is that he chooses to work through these often very ordinary acts of helping a child with their homework, taking the time to meet someone who needs support, looking over the budget for the month at work, preparing material for the kids' church class. And we do those things, and we do so trusting that God will be pleased to work through those activities. In many ways, I think Esther 5, and the book of Esther as a whole really, is very suited to those of us who are living as we are today in a secularized society. This is a story that doesn't mention God once. In a few moments, I'll be encouraging us to pray around the assisted suicide dying bill. Am I concerned about that? Personally, yes, I am. Has God been caught napping? No, he hasn't. Is he still in control? Yes, he is. Does the fact that he's in control means I don't have to do anything? No, it doesn't. Is he still in control if the bill gets passed? Yes, he is. God's sovereign oversight doesn't mean everything will go the way we necessarily wanted to go, at least in this age. There's no spiritual calculus which guarantees freedom from pain or loss. What we see is a world in which God's people must commit themselves to the care and oversight of things on the one hand, that God himself will work through us, but at the same time, we use all the wisdom and insight that he's been pleased to give us. And the two work together as we see them during the book of Esther. We live in a world in which we know and affirm God's presence with us, but where the mystery of that means we can't dictate to him whether and where and how he will work. And yet we continue with the wisdom that he has given us, trusting that his gracious plan will be worked out.